Welcome to another edition of the News Review. In this edition, Syrian army has launched a ground military operation against the Daesh terror group in the northern province of Raqqa. The operation kicked off on Thursday, taking place in an area in the southeast of Raqqa province. It follows increased activity by remnants of Daesh terrorists in that area in recent weeks. That, according to Russia's Sputnik news agency, citing local sources. It says government troops backed by Syrian and Russian warplanes have killed a number of terrorists without specifying. Just earlier this week, Daesh claimed a bus attack in the same Raqqa area killed 13 people. Syria has long complained that Daesh and other terror groups it is fighting are backed by Western states. To discuss that further, we're joined by Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian, joining us live from London, and also Fra Hughes, author and journalist from Belfast. Let's begin with Marcus Papadopoulos. Sir, Syria has already had a lot on its plate, from illegal U.S. military presence to the Israeli attacks on its sovereignty, and Turkey's plans, of course, for an incursion. And now this sudden uptick in Daesh offensives. How do you evaluate Syria's response to this latest challenge?
Well, whilst most of Syrian soil has been liberated by the Syrian Arab Army, which is the defender of multi-confessional Syria, whereby Muslim and Christian soldiers stand side by side and fight side by side to defend their fatherland from the clutches of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, nonetheless, parts of Syria remain illegally occupied by foreign forces. Thus, in the northeast of Syria, parts there are illegally occupied by the American army, and parts in the northwest of Syria are illegally occupied by the Turkish army, which works in coordination with Al-Qaeda. And let us be very clear about something. Those parts of Syria which are illegally occupied by two NATO members, which completely refutes the argument of NATO's leaders that the military bloc is a defensive and peaceful one. Now, under international law, the Syrian Arab Army, which is the only legitimate military force in Syria, has every right to conduct an offensive to liberate what remains in Syria occupied by foreign forces. Syria is a member of the United Nations. Syria's borders are recognized by the United Nations. The sanctity of internationally recognized borders has, however, been completely violated by the illegal occupation of parts of northern Syria by two NATO members, America and Turkey. So again, I can only emphasize that the Syrian Arab Army is within its full rights to conduct an offensive to liberate Raqqa, and indeed, if the day comes when the Syrian Arab Army launches an offensive to liberate parts of northeastern Syria, which are occupied illegally, the Syrian Arab Army would also be fully entitled to do so under international law.
So, Mr. Papadopoulos, you pointed to a few very interesting issues right there. Let's bring in Fra Hughes. Mr. Hughes, Syria is launching a fresh offensive to eliminate pockets of Daesh that have been staging attacks on military and civilian targets in parts of the country. How serious do you see the risk of Daesh terrorists making a comeback in Syria?
Well, it could be argued for the fact that they have become more active is proof that either their numbers have increased, they have been emboldened by the aid, succor and support that they gained from Turkey. It could be a prelude to further Turkish incursion an illegal military occupation of further parts of Syria. They could very much be used as a spearhead to probe, to attack, and to destabilize the whole northeastern region of Syria. The Syrian government does have a moral duty to its troops and its civilians to protect the infrastructure that's being used, the highways and the byways by which people travel, by which commerce travels, by which the Syrian Arab Army so it could be further by the Turkish use and Turkey policy.
Okay, you keep getting cut off, Mr. Hughes. Before we continue this discussion, let's take a look at some social media reactions to the story. So here we have Tony. Tony says that the Iraq war resulted in Iraqi resistance while also destabilizing the Middle East. ISIS appeared and grew under U.S. occupation, then spread into Syria after the West encouraged the Syrian people to overthrow Assad. ISIS took advantage of this and moved in. Daniel de Petres says Syria is complicated. Turkey, a NATO ally, is threatening a new offensive. The Kurds, supported by the U.S., were seeking help from Assad, who the U.S. opposes. And the U.S. still has 900 troops deployed there to fight ISIS territorial caliphate, and that is no longer existing. You got it? And finally, the Empire of Lies says Syria is very complicated. Remember in 2016 when two U.S.-funded militias in Syria fought each other, one armed by the CIA and one by the Pentagon. U.S. foreign policy in Syria and around the world has been a disaster, one misadventure after another. So let's bring back Mr. Papadopoulos. One of the key issues is the illegal U.S. presence in Syria, something that was also mentioned in those comments that I just read for you. And now we are seeing reports of American forces actually helping revive Daesh. Tell us how the U.S. military presence is getting in the way of a sustainable peace in Syria.
Well, whilst I said moments ago that hypothetically the day could come when the Syrian Arab Army launch an offensive in northeast Syria to liberate Syrian lands from the illegal occupation of the American army, that, in my opinion, is unrealistic because, of course, the Syrian Arab Army would be confronting the American military. And I do not believe that that would be in the interests of the Syrian government to do so. However, whilst the American military remains illegally inside of Syria, it means that the Americans have a foothold in Syria in which to one day in the future, I suspect the distant future, to try again to topple the Syrian government and to replace the Syrian government with a pro-Western one. I also believe that it is more than conceivable and very plausible to argue that by the Americans encouraging the terrorist groups in Raqqa to go on the offensive, and we know that there is insurmountable evidence of Washington having backed those terrorist groups, it could be a way of the American government trying to force Russia to fight on two fronts simultaneously to try and weaken Russia, because we are very well aware that Russia is conducting a very serious military campaign in Ukraine. And if Daesh was to go on a full-blown offensive, then that would also result in the Russian military having to engage with significant parts of its military presence in Syria against the terrorist groups in support of the Syrian army. So, as I said, it is possible that the Americans are trying to force Russia to fight on two fronts at the same time to weaken Russia. If Russia is, for example, weakened in Ukraine, then of course the Ukrainian armed forces could gain the initiative. But in my opinion, the Russian military campaign is going exceedingly well for the Kremlin, and the Russian military presence in Syria is more than suffice to defeat the hordes of ISIS or Al Qaeda or any other terrorist formation in that country.
Okay, Mr. Hughes, there are reports of U.S. forces relocating Daesh elements from Iraq and jails inside Syria to near their bases. American forces are said to be providing intensive military training to Daesh operatives. How do you read into that? What are the U.S. plans for Syria, in your opinion?
I think the first and most important thing for the American administration in Syria at the moment, apart from the continued destabilization of the country, continuing the war, is to solidify its positions, because it wants the oil and it wants the wheat. Again, the conflict in Ukraine, which is affecting oil prices, oil supply, wheat prices and wheat supply, has a mirror image in Syria. While Syrians are starving, their natural resources are being stolen by America. I do agree that it's in American interests to draw Russia further into the conflict in Syria, but I believe it will only be the Russian Air Force and not necessarily Russian troops who will be drawn further into and onto the battlefield. I think America, we are witnessing under Biden, is yet another war-mongering leader, another war criminal, mass murderer, who is determined to help the elite, the 1% corporate administrations in America, which back the political government of Joe Biden, by helping them earn more money through the military-industrial war complex. They're not concerned about civilian lives in Ukraine or in Syria. It's all about the money, it's all about the oil, it's all about the wheat, it's all about the Balkanization of Syria, and if they get their way, the future Balkanization of Russia as we go forward.
Thank you. Fra Hughes, author and journalist out of Belfast, and Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian out of London. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for sharing your views and thoughts with us, and thanks to all of our viewers for watching this edition of the News Review.